Hey, it's Rachel. I'm out in my very much in progress vegetable garden. I am a big fan of cover crops. I use them all the time. I love living mulches, and this one ended up being a complete and utter waste of time and money and effort. Figured I would share what I was trying to do and why it didn't work, and talk about what I'm going to do differently next here. And hopefully this is helpful to other people that are trying to decide if and how to work these into their garden. My garden design has a total of 10 beds in it, and on an ongoing basis, I think that works pretty well for what I want to grow. That design for 10 beds included one bed dedicated entirely to onions, one for potatoes, and one for sweet potatoes. Because I got a late start due to our construction, I did a prior video on that. Those crops, when it was time to put them in the ground, I didn't have a garden. And consequently, the potatoes are in grow bags, so are my sole survivor sweet potatoes. I've got a few bags of those. And then the onions I planted in the back of the property. But consequently, I ended up with a lot of space that's unplanted this year. What I was trying to do was to protect these empty beds. I'll post a video soon on why I'm using this design for the beds with the concrete blocks on the edges. I'm really happy with how they're coming together, but I mean, just visually, you can kind of get a sense here. These are a lot of work. Even though my design was for 10 beds, I knew I was only going to really be able to plant 4 of them. So my initial thought was, these beds are a lot of work, let's just do these 4 beds for now. And then for the 6 vacant beds, my original plan was to just put this weed fabric down on what will be the walkways and leave these guys essentially unplanted. Don't bother building the edges and just cover it with a living mulch and a cover crop in order to keep it from becoming completely infested with weeds. Why I wanted to do a cover crop, why I do them in general, bunch of benefits, and all of them do apply here. They can help discourage weeds. They shade the soil and prevent it from being solarized in the sun. They can add organic matter to the ground with their roots. If they fix nitrogen, you can also add nitrogen to your soil. They can attract beneficial insects. They can be a trap crop to protect your main things. Lots and lots of good reasons to have cover crops in your garden. But there are 2 big limitations, and they are the reason that this didn't work. First, they can help discourage weeds, but they cannot outcompete aggressive existing weeds. This bed is at the north end of my garden, and you can see there's a little bit of grass popping up here and there, but generally fairly low weed pressure in this part of the garden, and the alfalfa was really taking hold, living its best life, and I had some pretty good hopes for it. The problem is back here. So this is the southwest corner of our garden and our yard. This area was disturbed repeatedly during the construction, and you can see just outside of the garden in what is eventually going to be the dog run, tons of crabgrass sprang up and started to infiltrate the garden through runners underground, and these beds have been completely overwhelmed by the crabgrass. The alfalfa, I think, is, here you go. It's theoretically in here some places, but man, it is no match for this crabgrass. And effectively, it's like I didn't put anything in this bed at all. Second big limitation is inflexibility. Once you plant these things, that's where they have to live. That sounds obvious, but if, like me, you're still kind of in flux with your design and you're figuring it out as you go, just be aware that cover crops are probably not going to give you the ability to change when you need to. I underestimated how much I was going to hate the visual of my garden. I have had to put down weed barrier paper, cardboard to keep weeds from coming up in the pathways. And every time we've had a storm, those have blown all over the place. So you can see my beautiful CMU block there, OSB sheets, random pieces of wood. I have just done anything I could to try and keep the weed pressure down, but consequently the garden just looks terrible. And I decided, you know what, let's just go ahead, bite the bullet, and put the CMU borders around every single bed. Might or might not be a good life choice, but I am happy with how the garden's coming together. The problem is that as I'm digging the edges of the beds to put in these blocks, I'm disrupting all of the alfalfa. Not only am I tearing it out of the edges as I dig, but I'm burying it as I move that soil into the center of the beds. And I want the soil there. I'm not gonna not put the soil in there just to save this alfalfa. And as I'm digging up the edges and disturbing them, I'm further encouraging the growth of weeds to come into these beds. With all of this change that I still need to make in the garden, I never really should have put this alfalfa in the first place. I am going to go through, rake these even, probably burying the alfalfa in the process, and I'm going to cut some black tarp that I do have on hand. I'm going to lay that tarp over these beds and leave it in place for probably the whole, next 4 to 5 weeks until everything is good and dead underneath. And then I will plant it with a different cover crop mix of peas and oats. You can see that where I have put down weed fabric, all of the ground underneath is weed free. So if I just put down a physical barrier to block the sun, I am fairly confident that these beds will be weed free and I will exhaust that seed bank in time to put in my cover crop. The experience has not turned me off of using cover crops or living mulch. In fact, I have a bunch of mustard that I just underplanted under my tomatoes. That's what I like to put in here. I am still using them. It's just, I'm going to be a little more thoughtful next time about how I prepare the beds ahead of time. That's it, quick one, hope it was helpful. I do recommend cover crops and living mulches. I would suggest that you take a hard look at whether your garden design is really locked and loaded and you're sure you're not gonna change things. And if so, by all means, go ahead and use cover crops or living mulch. Just do make sure you also assess the strength of the underlying existing weed seed bank and prepare your beds accordingly. That is what I'm gonna do now. I recommend you guys do it in the first place. Be smarter than me. I've got some extra bonus content here at the end. I'm gonna walk through a table that lays out a bunch of different cover crops and their attributes and how I use all of them. If that is of interest to you, please stick around for that detail. If not, I hope the main content was helpful. I mentioned I'm gonna plant this to peas and oats. That's not because there's anything wrong with alfalfa. I just ran out of my alfalfa seed. It's because peas and oats replicate the benefits that I get from alfalfa. Alfalfa is a really great one for me to plant after my root crops, and it can grow fairly quickly, it gets tall, and it can shelter that soil through the fall and winter. It will then winter kill for me, and I don't have to worry about terminating it or digging it under. Alfalfa will fix nitrogen. It has nice deep roots that'll go into the soil, and when it blooms, it provides great pollinator support. Quick note on the winter killing, make sure you get a non-dormant type if you want that benefit. The peas and oats mixture isn't something I normally use, but I happen to have some as a sample, and it will give some of the same benefits as the alfalfa. The oats will put a ton of fibrous root mass into the ground, and the peas will fix nitrogen. The combination of the two together gives me what alfalfa gives me. The only limitation on alfalfa is that it is pretty tall. It's like 2 to 4 feet tall. So it really isn't something you're going to use as a living mulch. This is something that you would use as a cover crop all on its own. Buckwheat, in contrast, is something that I undersow. So buckwheat is a really fast grower, and I use it in between spring and fall plantings of things like salad greens and broccoli. I undersow it beneath the spring crops, and it gets pretty tall pretty quick. It's 6 weeks to get to full maturity. And at that point, it's providing some nice shade to those spring greens and extending the harvest. It also is absolutely wonderful for pollinator support. And it's a dynamic accumulator, meaning the plant roots will find and concentrate specific nutrients in the soil that can be kind of rare. And when you cut down the buckwheat and allow it to decompose in place, it brings those nutrients closer to the surface and makes them available to the plants. The only limitation on buckwheat is that it reseeds really readily, and if you don't want little baby buckwheats everywhere, you either have to cut this thing down when it's flowering or be really diligent about harvesting those growths as they mature, or just accept it and have buckwheat. Mustard, how I use this one, I've got it planted out there right now. I underplant this normally in any bed the year before it's going to get a solanaceae plant. So think tomatoes, peppers, potatoes, things like that. And the reason is that when it breaks down in the soil, it produces allyl isothiocyanates. Probably mispronounced that, but there's been some scientific studies that it does help as a soil fumigant against some of the common solanaceae diseases. The other nice thing about mustard is that it provides pollinator support. Subterranean clover is the short one on this list. This is a living mulch, and it can go beneath heavy feeding plants like tomatoes, peppers, broccoli, and give them a boost of nitrogen. As long as you use subterranean clover, which is an annual, it will winter kill, and it does provide wonderful pollinator support. Honestly, I don't know of any limitations on this one. It's a nice crop, and I like to use it pretty often. Holy basil isn't exactly a cover crop or a living mulch, but I wanted to put this one and borage on to just call out some of their benefits. They are, in the case of holy basil, something that I plant near the base of squash plants in particular. I just did a video on squash pest management, and one of the nice things about holy basil is that it has this really wonderful, super strong scent. And according to many people, and I think from my own personal experience, if you put this close to the squash plants, it does seem to confuse some of those pests and keep them away from it. They attract pollinators like crazy. It's a really, really wonderful pollinator plant. And this is also known as tulsi. This plant is used heavily in Southeast Asian kind of herbal medicine, and there's a really wonderful antioxidant tea that you can make from the leaves. A little fun benefit there. Borage is another wonderful, wonderful pollinator plant. Like, my goodness, if you want bees in your garden, just stick a borage in there. The flowers are also edible, and they make a fun little addition to salads. They kind of taste like cucumber. The only limitation on this guy, I mean, the seeds are tiny. It's like the size of a couple grains of rice, but the actual plant is huge. These things get very, very big. They do have prickly leaves, which can be, a little annoying when you're going around and working in the garden. And then the main call out on borage is that this thing reseeds everywhere. I mean, it's crazy. I get borage in places I have never grown borage. I don't mind it because it's this nice little pop-up pollinator plant. Just be aware that planting borage once kind of means planting borage forever. That is it. I hope that was useful for you, especially if you stuck around all the way to the end. It was a good use of your time. If you have any questions about cover crops that I didn't mention, please post them and I will address them as quickly as I can. Thanks.